kind of loose, you know.
Interesting.
I think I've seen Katie with a collar and a dress, right? It's kind of interesting. It has a
Mhm,
different look.
mhm.
But-
She wears it very infrequently, only for functionary purposes.
Yeah.
Does she wear it when she on Sundays, like when we're in person?
Yeah, usually if it's a sacramental piece, she'll wear it, but mostly she doesn't throughout the week, so.
Yeah.
Is Scott
Those
coming?
are live on
You know,
Facebook.
Scott was here. He was in the as an attendee, and I went to promote him as a panelist, and then he went away. So I hope he comes back.
Yes.
His name was there, and I said promote to panelist, and now I don't see him. I've been checking because I think he's the only one we're still waiting for.
Does anybody have a cell phone number that could shoot him a text?
No, Larry probably does. Larry, I think you can hear us, but here, I'm going to allow you to talk, Larry. If you want to unmute, I don't know if you can hear us.
Larry.
He looks like he still might be muted.
He's muted himself, but he may not be listening right now. But he has the ability to speak now.
Well, should we keep Larry here until Scott comes?
Yeah, I guess we can.
Good idea.
Yeah, hopefully he'll join us here in a minute.
This might just be like one of our normal meetings.
It feels like that, I think, when you can't see the audience.
I think that's one of the values of this approach.
Mm-hmm.
Hmm.
It feels more intimate.
Hey, did any of you see that Ken Burns short clip on monuments? It was about the building of the Statue of Liberty, and about, that was incredibly brilliant. I'll dig it up and send it around.
Was it recent or?
Yeah,
I've seen
I
a
think
lot
it
of
was-
documentaries, but
It was a 5-minute clip. I think it was a comment on the question of removing Confederate statues and things like that.
like,
Did it
Okay,
include
I'll
the
check that
Mount Rushmore discussion as well?
No, no,
Okay.
no. It was mostly, I think, about the Statue of Liberty.
My phone.
I saw one on the Mount Rushmore discussion that was interesting.
What was that about?
Yeah, what was that?
So the Mount Rushmore, where Mount Rushmore was a sacred space for one of the native tribes in that area, the Sioux tribe, and the Sioux Nation, sorry. And they see the Mount Rushmore is just as harmful of a piece of monument as Black Americans do the Confederate.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
they were having a conversation around that because of because of a lot of different things, but also the 4th of July presidential address is going to be given at Mount Rushmore.
Mhm.
Oh.
I was unaware of that. Up there, Scott.
there he is.
Sorry about that.
Hi, Scott.
How's it going, everybody?
It's going well. How about with you?
It is going all right.
So are you going to remove Larry? Yeah, there you go.
Yep. Sorry, Larry.
Look at this perfect 9 square.
I always feel like the Brady Bunch.
It totally
Oh,
is
yeah.
Brady Bunch.
I always want to do one of the things where we all look up and down into the side.
Right. Or like you pass something from one screen to the next.
We tried that for a service one time, and then because we recorded it, and then when we recorded it, all of our boxes switched.
Oh,
Yeah.
yeah. I think it might look different on everyone's screens. So I will probably introduce all of you instead of having you introduce yourself, because it might be tricky to figure out what order to go in.
That sounds like a good plan to me.
That reason. So if people are just joining us, we'll get started in a few minutes. We're just going to give other people some time to log in, and
Yeah, we're ahead of the game.
yeah. We've got about 10 people in attendance right now.
Tim and Marshall, are you going camping again in your groovy little camper soon?
We are.
We are
tomorrow
Where are you
morning.
going?
up in the Zirkles. I dropped the camper today.
You what?
I dropped the camper today. I drove it up there and got our camp spot. You got to get up there early.
Yeah.
Oh, that's camping lingo. I dropped the camper.
You haven't heard that?
Secret spot.
Not sounding like rough camping there.
No,
No, it's posh.
we're glamping.
The kids must love it.
They do. It's really fun.
Yeah, I can
Yeah.
imagine. High adventure.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And then what do you do? Just go hike around up there and stuff?
Hiking, we go to the lakes. We'll probably go to Pearl Lake tomorrow, maybe Steamboat Lake, and maybe hike Cons Peak.
There's a lot of mountain biking as well.
Bring bikes.
Oh, the kids do mountain biking too?
No, they
Oh,
go about
they
100
kinda-
yards.
Yeah, they kind of, yeah.
And then they're
will.
done.
Yeah, they take after their dad.
Yeah, exactly.
I remember taking a hike to the causeway once, and there was a couple and their child, and they kept offering him gummy bears. You know, okay, come on, keep coming, keep coming. And I was like, oh, I can relate to that.
Yeah.
Bribing your child to hike.
To cross the causeway.
No, they hadn't even gotten up there. I figured at the point they were at, if they were already into heavy bribing, I wasn't too sure they were going to actually get to the causeway.
Pretty sketch. This causeway is really sketch.
I have me
That's a
and
lot
3
of gummy
friends are
bears
going
across that
camping.
thing.
We're going camping tomorrow too. And we were late, Tim. We did not plan far enough ahead. And so there were like no camping spots. So
Yeah.
we're ending up in Granby. So we'll see how it goes.
Yeah. I'm imagining there's going to be a lot more campers where I put our camper by the time we get up there tomorrow, but it'll be one big happy campsite.
So you reserve it in advance and then there's a
No,
fee
you
and-
don't. It's like up there, it's like you can go camp for 2 weeks.
It's dispersed camping. So you just kind of go out, and there's certain areas where you don't even need a permit. You just go camp. You have to be like 100 feet off the road and things like that and away from a water source. But
How are the mosquitoes up in the circles right now?
I think they're going
they weren't too bad last time.
to,
I haven't been
yeah, I
there.
think they're going to be pretty bad this time though.
Yeah.
I mean, it's
3
just
inch.
starting to ramp up.
Bad everywhere right now.
Yeah, they're
Yeah.
pretty bad now. Yeah.
Should we?
Well, we'll maybe just it's just like a minute after 6:30 and
Maybe wait a couple more minutes.
we're
then.
on steamboat time.
Always.
Always, yeah. Give it a couple. So if you're just joining us, thank you for joining us. We're just chit-chatting about camping. If you're wondering that we have not actually started the panel discussion yet tonight, we're just waiting to give people time to get signed in, and then we'll get started. And if anyone has any questions or anything, feel free to put it in the chat. And then for the panelists, I think you guys, we don't have any background noise if you're off mute. So just so the conversation can flow, I think it's fine for you to all stay off of mute and be able to just to keep the conversation flowing, so you don't have to mute and unmute every time you talk.
I think I'm going to stay on mute just so I have a dinner that's happening in the other room just in case they decide
Oh,
to
it's loud
mute
or
something.
something.
Yeah.
Okay.
But I'll just click on and off. It's pretty easy for me to do that.
Yeah.
Should we raise our hand if we want to speak and somebody else is just about to finish what they're saying?
I think you could, but I'd also just encourage you to jump in, you know. If you feel like you can't get a word in, then go ahead and raise your hand and we'll make sure
Yeah.
you get an opportunity to speak. But as we talked about, I think it's really helpful just to have, just like our monthly meetings, as much as you guys just can have conversation. That's really great.
Sometimes I end up being a little bit more silent than I should be. So I'll try to speak a little bit more than I have in the past.
You need assertiveness training, Steve.
It might work.
Yeah.
Did
You
you
know,
always
and-
let your twin brother speak first?
Well, he might have. I was hard of hearing because I had this birth defect that made me turn my head. So I always had more earaches than he did. So I learned to listen, try to listen and figure out what's going on. And sometimes that tendency overwhelms me. And with you guys, everybody wants to speak. So I have still to learn how to represent my points of view a little bit more timely. So,
What happened?
Coffee, drink a couple of cups of coffee ahead of time.
We will try to open up a way for you to talk. We'll try to invite it more.
Okay.
uh-oh.
you know?
Well,
So maybe we
okay.
should get started.
Yeah, I was just going to say, why don't we go ahead and get started? Maggie, whenever you're ready to come back on. Well, thank you everyone for being with us tonight. Appreciate you all showing up and being a part of this conversation. There will be time for those of you who are in attendance to speak, to ask questions, usually around halfway through. Our event will go until 8 p.m., close to that. And so there will be an opportunity for you to ask questions or offer your thoughts on the conversation coming up. So feel free to be putting things in the Q&A and we'll get to those. And also if people want to speak, I can allow that to happen too when it's time for questions. So I'd like to just start by introducing each of the panelists, and maybe you could just wave when I introduce you so they know who we're talking about. So we have Karen Post, who's the leader of our local Course in Miracles group. Bishop Newell Linford. He is the bishop at the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. And we have Tim Olmsted, who's the spiritual director at the Buddhist Center. Joanne Grace, who is representing St. Paul's Episcopal Church, and she is also the spiritual director at Northwest Health Colorado Hospice. And Steve Agner, who is a practitioner of Islam, representing Sufi Islam. Rabbi Scott Siegel from Har Mishpacha, the Jewish congregation here in Steamboat. Ernest Bayer with Holy Name Catholic Church. And assistant pastor Maggie Taylor, who is with Heart of Steamboat Methodist Church. I hope I got all your titles right. So thank you, all the panelists, for being here. I'll let Tim just talk a little bit about who we are and what we do if you've never been to an Exploring the Sacred event before.
Yeah, I feel like most of you probably have been to this event, but we've been doing this now for 16 years. And we started it as an effort to bring our community together in the midst of a lot of turmoil. I feel like the turmoil hasn't diminished at all. If anything, it's maybe ratcheted up. So I feel like our efforts, what we're trying to do is show our local community that we can come together with differing opinions and still respectfully disagree and have intelligent conversation, and hopefully show the community that we can agree to disagree and still live together in a cohesive way and model for our children how to create a better world. So that's sort of the whole reason that Exploring the Sacred has started and is still going on.
Great, thanks, Tim. So tonight's topic is Heal Oneself, Heal the World, Addressing Bias. So as you can imagine, this conversation came out of what's been happening as of late in our world, this increasing awareness of racial bias, discrimination, oppression that's happening in our country. And not to say that it's just starting to happen, but I think that our awareness of it as a country is increasing and being brought to the forefront, which I think is wonderful and really important. And so as religious leaders in Steamboat, we try to address what's going on in the world and how our leaders, we look to them as the sort of moral compass for our community. And so the conversation tonight will be based around how do we address bias? How do we recognize it? How do we see it in ourselves? What can we do to create change? How do we work within systems and within one's faith to move this conversation forward? And some of you may have seen this, but in the last month, these leaders have come together to create a statement that they all have agreed on. It's on our website, and it was in the paper today. And I just wanted to read it to all of you before we get started here. Unitedly, we declare that the answers to racism, prejudice, discrimination, and hate will not come from government or law enforcement alone. Solutions will come as we open our hearts and minds to those whose lives are different than our own, examine our own biases, work to build bonds of genuine friendship, and to see each other as beloved equals. As religious leaders of Steamboat Springs, we commit to do our part to transform fear and hate into trust and love in order to create a kinder, wiser, and more compassionate world. So I really appreciated that statement. And tonight I see is going to be more kind of the nuts and bolts of like, how do we do that? It's a pretty lofty statement. But I'd like to start with the first question, and anyone can jump in. But where do you feel like bias comes from? Why and how do we form bias?
Well, I think it's a natural part of as we grow up, in psychology, we're taught that pretty much everything you believe, you're taught by the time you're 5. We add to it, but the template for how we understand ourselves and the world around us is sort of given to us by then. And so though we have plenty of new experiences past that age, we filter it in through that template. And so we're adopting biases without even knowing it. And they're not necessarily all negative. But if we never think about the fact that, each one of our ways of understanding the world is probably as unique as our fingerprint, then we kind of think that everybody sees the world the same way we do. And, one of the things the course really works about is how do you unlearn everything that you've learned so that you really can be open to other understandings. And so I think biases just come naturally. We then have to see how we can break them down.
Now, I would agree with what Karen says, that I really do think that bias is formed in our environment. But I also think it's the experiences that we have, or it's other people's experiences that they share with us. It's the teaching we receive. And a lot of it probably is formed at a very early age while young people are still in the home. Unwinding that bias can be really tricky. It's probably the more or the longer that an individual has bias, the trickier it is to unwind that and to unlearn that bias. And it's something that I know I can work on, and I think I really am thankful for conversations with the people here on the panel, so I can learn. And I think this is one way to really help address and maybe uncover bias.
I would agree with both of those statements again, but also I would take apart bias into 2 different types: explicit and implicit bias. That explicit bias is the things that we know we're biased about. We understand, like, I don't like green peas. We're biased toward, like, we're biased against that thing. And it's something we express and something that we are very comfortable making known to the world. And some things are implicit bias. They're bias that we learn and kind of like they live underneath the skin of our decisions and the way that we move in the world. And I think implicit bias oftentimes gets overlooked because it's so hard for us to identify. It takes a lot of introspective work and a lot of thinking just about how we move through the world and how we interact with other people.
Yeah, great. Good point, Maggie.
I was born as a twin, and therefore everything I did had somebody right next to me who may have had another opinion or who may have said first what he wanted to say. So I never grew up just by myself. I always had someone with whom I had to interact. And that may have helped me quite a bit in that sometimes I would defer to my twin brother Dave. Other times I would feel compelled to say something first. So I learned somewhat early to be able to observe and understand when someone else wants to say something and why they might want to say it. I also discovered within myself those same kind of activities and behaviors. But as I grew up, I realized, well, by the time I was 26, I realized that I needed to learn more about other religions, and I needed to understand why they meant something, why they meant what they did to other persons, because I felt that my knowledge of my first religion wasn't sufficient to guide me. And so that's when I started acting a little bit, not on bias, but I was searching for answers that made sense to me.
I think that one of the issues is that we actually believe, each of us, explicitly or implicitly, as Maggie was saying, that we see the world in some kind of rendition that's accurate.
Mhm.
Actually, we don't. I mean, each person here, if we talk about the same movie, for instance, we would have a completely different experience. So we come into this world with sort of karmic patterning, we would say, sort of biases that we take from lifetime to lifetime. And then, as Karen was saying, then upon that is heaped on sort of cultural and familial biases, then biases that are response to trauma and, growing up experiences. And the problem, I think, is not so much that we have bias, because we all do. It's that we actually believe we don't. And that
Right.
when we look out in the world, that we see a world in the same way that the person next to us, and that there's some semblance of accuracy, when actually we would suggest that it's wildly inaccurate. So we're sort of bias is just kind of wired into us. And until we acknowledge that and really, really begin to dig into that quality of conditioning, we end up causing harm because we respond to each other in a way that's not accurate to the way the other person is. And so bias invariably causes harm in some way to ourselves or to others.
Tim, I
I
was
think one of
curious
the
when
things
you
that's an
talked
important-
about the nature of bias being wired into us in that kind of sense. Reminded me of one of the causes I find for bias has simply to do with the fact that our brains are wired to be biased, in the sense that tribal, the condition of being tribe, being connected, being a sense of belonging, whatever that is, we like to be with people that are like us. And so we have a tendency to group in that kind of way. And, the survival aspect has a lot to do then with, gosh, if I'm being threatened, I'm going to go with the people that I know that are like me. And I think that too often we underestimate the nature of the physiological or biological impact of bias. that it's almost as though we cannot not be biased. That's just part of the way we're wired. And when we layer that with other causes like that we've been talking about in terms of just the psychological one that Karen was talking about, or the experiential one, the environmental one that Newell was talking about, I think there's a multiplicity of reasons where bias comes from. And we can't just look at one. We have to be aware of each one of those and how that impacts us. So that if it is instinctual response, then it behooves us to become aware of them, and then take our higher mind or higher consciousness, as Steve would probably talk about it, to really wrestle with it, make changes that we need to.
Yeah, great.
I have to respectfully disagree with the idea that we are kind of inherently biased. I think that what we sometimes view as inherent bias that we might see in the way, a child reacts to something, or, that these biases that we have that seem to be with us from the jump, are really much more of a socialization question. We might, the thing that we might view as bias of wanting or being more comfortable with people who, look like us or act like us or whatever, I think is connected to, might be more connected to the fact that, from an early age and maybe for a long time, many of us, whether it's in our home life, our school life, our religious life, are surrounded by people like that. And so we kind of come to absorb that as being what's normal, come to absorb that as being what's safe and right or fair. Whereas, and I don't know if someone were kind of from the beginning grows up or is raised in a situation where there is great diversity, would that person still exhibit the same kinds of biases that we sometimes feel are inherent? And I also wanted to kind of raise the idea, especially in this particular context. I agree that a lot of our biases are born early on in our lives, and that oftentimes those biases are passed on to us, usually unintentionally, by those places and institutions that we feel the most trust towards, especially early on. So, family is one, school early on is one, and in our faith communities, I think, is one. And so, the messaging, whether it's overt or covert, that we're putting out is having impact on the people and the young people, the kids in our communities. And, so the question then becomes, I think, what are the messages that we're putting forward, and how might we be influencing these biases, even though we're trying our best not to?
Great, thanks, Scott.
I was thinking something along the same lines as Scott in terms of, from the biblical perspective, I think the original situation was harmony, love, unity, equality, and all of the biases, as we would say, from a Christian perspective, based on the Bible, they're a result of sin. Like that's our fallen nature, but our original nature, as we're created, is to be in harmony, like Adam and Eve in harmony in the garden, before the disobedience. So I think the biases come from insecurity, basically. When I feel like I'm competing against you, therefore I have to be better than you. You're different from me. I must be better than you, or else it's sort of rooted in an insecurity based on competition, which sets up like an us versus them kind of diversity dilemma. And so then we try to be we try to protect ourselves or preserve ourselves, and we formulate the biases that somebody else is not as good as us, or they're a threat to us. But I think the antidote to that from a religious perspective is to believe that we're all created in God's image, as we're told in Genesis 1, created in God's image, and that we're all equally loved. And if we have that basic sense, then we're rooted in more of a security that comes from faith. and we don't have to fear the other person.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Ernest. Yeah, so a wide range of perspectives, from that it's natural, it's something that we're born with, to it's something that we're enculturated into, that's given to us by our society or our institutions, to that it's biological. So the next question that I'd like to know is, for each of you individually, what are you doing? Are there things that you're doing individually to raise your own awareness of your bias? You know, Tim, you had talked about we need to recognize and acknowledge that we have a lens. And Maggie, you're talking about implicit bias, which are those parts that we're not aware of, right? Biases that we may have and we don't know that we have them. So are there ways that you guys are sort of waking yourselves up to your own biases?
Well, I think going with what Maggie said about, the ones we don't know, and I think, what Scott was talking about, in a way, the only way we can find those out is to move out of those smaller circles that we tend to exist in. They may seem safer, as Ernest was talking about. So how do we get out of our comfort zones? How do we move into the foreign? I mean, one of the things in us talking together is, we're learning different things about each other's, faith traditions, but how often do we within our faith traditions encourage people to go out and explore, other faiths, and to understand that, things like travel, things that really allow you to come up against your biases, because all of a sudden you didn't think about something in a certain way. I think I've shared here when I worked as a children's social worker in Watts and in Compton, and the vast majority of the people I worked with were Black, the vast majority of my clients. But as I was listening to my coworkers, who were very well-educated people, I had never experienced or heard of what the challenges were that they were coming up against, against the LAPD. If I had never gone into a work environment where I was by far the minority, I don't think I would have understood it, the way I did. And that was back in the early 90s, and started to realize what a problem there was. So sometimes we've just got to get out of our bubble to be exposed, so that we find out that we actually think about the world. As Tim was saying, I think I understand the world. I was pretty well traveled at that point. I thought I got it. And then I got into an environment where I said, I really do not understand how a certain percentage of the US experiences life. And so for me, that's what it is: getting out of the familiar and moving into foreign things. But then you come up against that fear that you were talking about, Ernest. That doesn't necessarily feel safe. And so we got to walk into our own fears.
I'd be interested to hear what Maggie has to say about this question. How do we navigate ourselves around the implicit bias issue? I mean, just the concept implicit bias is new in my world in the last, few years. So
yeah.
I'm no expert.
It's something, as I studied psychology in depth, and how it has to deal with bias, how it has to deal with prejudice. And one of the things that I found is by reading authors that aren't like me, by reading people's perspectives that I might not have experienced. A lot of times when we pick up a book, we look for someone who looks like us or who has an experience like us and might see the world through the same lens in which we do. But when we take the time to read or to explore or to watch pieces of art, fiction or nonfiction, that come from a different cultural, different background, I think it really helps us understand, without putting another person on the spot, like that one friend you have that might be completely different than everyone else. It helps us to see into a lens of this different perspective that we would never have considered. And it really has made me think personally. I personally had never thought about the what people who are migrants or immigrants in our country feel, because I was born in this country and I've always had United States citizenship, and something I always have taken for granted. And then I read a book called The Devil's Highway, and it just opened my eyes to so many things. And I think that's where I saw my bias, and then I started to explore and educate myself from there.
You know, there's a great, this quote will be familiar. It's a quote from Mark Twain. He said, "Travel is fatal to prejudice, bigotry, and narrow-mindedness, and many of our people need it sorely on these accounts. Broad, wholesome, charitable views of men and things cannot be acquired by vegetating in one little corner of the earth, all in one's lifetime." You know, our family was talking to, this was a couple years ago, we were talking to somebody who lives here in Steamboat who hadn't left Steamboat in over 20 years. That's, I know, right? That's hard to do. I think Mark Twain was right. And Karen mentioned travel. You know, for those of us, and I know probably, well, I'm guessing probably many on the FaceTime stream as well with us tonight, have traveled a lot. And it's really something to see how other races and cultures work. There are a lot of things that we have in common globally, such as, you know, families or love or the striving for peace and harmony. But there are so many other ways to do things, other beliefs that cultures have, other thoughts, and different, you know, people that look completely different than us. And those, I think the more that people can expose themselves, and this, the better that maybe they can uncover and address their biases. It's a little tough right now with COVID-19 for travel. It's kind of shut down international travel and a lot of domestic travel. Although there's quite a few good deals on right now. Just type in promo code COVID-19. You can get a steal.
I think Maggie's right, though, Noel. We don't just need to travel physically. Yeah. We can travel mentally by reading different books. And
oh, yeah. I agree with that.
Yeah.
It's good to get different perspectives, for sure. Yeah, that's a great point, Maggie. Thanks.
One of the things that I've been doing, which anyone from Harmish Bacha is watching, this will sound very familiar to them, is I love questions. I love questions and I hate answers. And so I've been asking myself lots and lots and lots of different kinds of questions. So like asking myself about, you know, the way I was educated, how has that impacted the way I see the world? You know, I grew up in the 80s, you know, I was in school in the 80s and in the early 90s. And so like how was my experience, my life experience and the way I view the world shaped by how, like the way I was taught, the things I was taught, you know, how have I benefited or continue to benefit from the systems, you know, both kind of societal and governmental that are being called into question. You know, speaking to what Maggie said about different kinds of authors, you know, what books have I read and am I reading? What kind of music am I listening to and playing for my kids? You know, what movies, shows, so all the cultural pieces. So trying to really kind of do a deep dive and ask myself a lot of questions about what I have done, how I kind of got to where I am, and to really explore kind of how that's affected, how that continues to affect the way I see the world and interact with the world.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Scott.
I came across a quote recently by a sister, Catholic Benedictine sister, who said, "There isn't anyone you couldn't love once you've heard their story." And that resonated with me. And I was thinking, sometimes in our church, homeless people wander in, whether they're passing through or whether they're just homeless, and they sit on our couch and they just kind of chill out there. And usually my first reaction is, I'm busy you can sit there fine, but I got to go do my thing. But now and then I stop and talk to them and I just listen to them and I let them tell me a little bit about why they're here and what's going on. And it's always a bit surprising, like we can talk about racism and stuff like that, but even like homeless, sometimes I see a homeless person, the first reaction is, oh, they must not have been good in school. They don't really want to work. They don't have a job. They're irresponsible or whatever. That could be the first prejudice. But sometimes when I hear their story, I'm like, oh my gosh, that could have been me, or that could have been my brother or whatever. And so for me, I haven't taken a lot of initiative, like this is what I'm going to do to uncover my biases, but I try to take advantage of the moment or the opportunity. Like, here's somebody different from me, and I'm going to choose not to ignore them, but I'm just going to choose to spend a few moments, just hear their story. And usually once I hear the story, I don't, I realize that I've been prejudiced or biased, and I come away with much more respect for them. So listening, I think.
Abraham Lincoln said, if you meet someone that you don't like, you just don't know them well enough.
Yeah, that's a good one.
Beautiful.
I like that.
That
Yeah.
says it all in a way.
Yeah.
Listening is very important. It's one of the first skills I learned because I didn't hear very well. So I learned to listen until I understood. And that led me to be a professor. And as a professor, I spoke a lot, but then I also asked questions and I listened to the nature of the question. I don't want to go into detail, but in 1999, I established a program for women who are trying to get off welfare. And we met once a week, and after every dinner, be about 50 of us, people who were wanting to be partners and help people who were on welfare, and we were not. But we listened to each other. We were taught how to listen. And so one person would speak for 3 minutes and the other person would listen. And what that prepares you to do is to fight the urge to listen to your ego or what you want to learn. And instead, whoops.
Yeah, you're there.
I hear you.
Okay. I must have hit mine. Anyway, so listening has been very important for me my whole life. And it still is an extremely important skill to develop. And I don't judge people. I'm not biased in any particular way. I think that's because I learned how to listen in order to make sense of my own life and the way to live my life.
Yeah, so I guess some of the themes here I'm hearing are listening, learning about others, being willing to reach out to people who are not like us, living in cultures or in countries or in neighborhoods that might be unfamiliar to us. Asking questions, I liked that, Scott, just like really questioning and evaluating your background. The other thing I think, just to add to it is humility. I think that's like for us to be willing to own that we have bias. Like, I saw this quote the other day just on Facebook, and it said, there's, two kinds of people in the world. There's people who are racist and don't know they're racist. And then there's people who are racist and know that they're racist and working to change it. And, I don't know that I completely agree, but it really made me think like, oh yeah, like I think if we can just start with assuming we all have bias, then it's like we're willing to look at it. We're willing, and it can be really uncomfortable. Like you were saying, Karen, it's usually not fun. We don't want to think that we're prejudiced or that we're biased. But if we start with, I'm not, then there doesn't leave any room for exploration. So I think it takes a big dose of humility too, to uncover these biases.
I'd like to add also that one of the things for me that has really heightened my awareness over the past, I would say 3 months or so, has a lot to do with the words, the power of word, and the word I choose to describe something to somebody. It can be as simple as I was talking the other day and we were talking about, well, how do we refer to these biases and when we talk about it? And the word that I choose might mean one thing for me as I say it, but in a different context, it might mean something entirely different to another person. And so whether that's, an example for me would be the other day I was talking about people of color. And then within this, the next sentence, I referenced colored people. And it's like, where does that all come from? Just a slight change of how I would use the word. And I just paused because one reference is current modern day language that I'm beginning to understand or figure out how do we articulate what's going on with our biases. The second reference has to do with, my mother being raised in Ohio in such a way that that was a whole different meaning to her. And so for me, in terms of just understanding that the word I choose to describe something, being more cautious about it. So as Steve says, listening and then pausing before you speak to choose the word you're going to use to describe it. And when I see a reaction from somebody, it's like a minefield. It's like, wait a minute, did I just step on something where that word meant something different to them?
Yeah, yeah, good point. Thank you for sharing that, Joanna. So, we've been talking about how we can do this ourselves in our own lives, how we can look at our own biases. What thoughts do you guys have in terms of how we can start to address the systemic racism and bias that is so clear that, I think we're continuing to shed light on how our governments, our policing system, our schools, employers, that so many of our systems are inherently biased. How do we, and I think you were mentioning too, Scott, even potentially our religious institutions. How do we start to create change on a systemic level?
First thing that came to my mind was education. So it's going to take a while, but what is the curriculum that kids are learning, as they're going through elementary school or high school or college? To have education about the history, every history book has an interpretation or a perspective, but to have different ways of looking at the history, particularly of our own country. So education, in history, but I think also in education and morality. Now, I don't know how the public school system can do that, but morality is an issue. Some things are right, some things are wrong. And how do we look at that? How do we look at that objectively? I think there needs to be more education in that area, other than just that's illegal, so you shouldn't do it or you'll get thrown in jail. There's a morality underneath the laws, and some laws are unjust. So I think sort of education in morality, and even I think in religion, like if there was more openness to studying all the different religions, there would be this sort of understanding that none of our religions promote racism, and it just doesn't seem to be, the best way to live. So education, I think, is a key. It just takes a while.
For me, when I try to navigate the labyrinth of all the biases and the biases that that I'm sure are there and I don't know it or I'm being accused of, I come back again and again to the image or the comment from the Buddha that he said that we should think of everybody like a mother thinks of her child, her only child. Mm. And so for me, that's a kind of baseline that if I would be more inclined to care for one person, my child as opposed to your child, this man on the street, like you said, Ernest, the homeless person coming in off the street, as opposed to someone, then I know already right out of the gate, there's something to turn around and look at, that there's an impulse either towards something as if it was my child or not, or away from something. And the Buddha said, and this is very easy for me because I can remember short guidance instructions, is that if I treat someone like they're your only child, and anything else would show a bias, I think.
One of the things that I think is critical in dismantling systemic racism, prejudice of any kind, is recognizing our own privilege and recognizing that we're going to have to put our privilege we're probably going to have to give up some of our privilege to enable those who are in a minority status or in a marginalized status to have anywhere close to the same privileges we have. So we will have to recognize that we can do something like speeding and be able to be pulled over without a certain anxiety in our body, or we can do all of these other things without an air of suspicion or an air of just worry that we carry, to be able to then look at the way policing works, look at the way our laws work, look at the way that we put our own comfort and our own protection and the protection even of our property over the value of their life. So for us, we have to first look at where we are, what we take for granted, what our bias and our privilege is, and then we can start to work on, why doesn't everyone have that? Why aren't we truthfully equal?
Yeah, great, Maggie. Good point.
Every night before I go to bed, I've said this before, but I review my actions and behaviors of the day. And then I assess the extent to which I may have, in God's view, made a mistake, and I may have been selfish or whatever. And I also think about issues that bother me in my community, wherever I may live. And that's when I desire or set up an action plan to establish a program for people who might commit suicide or whatever. So in assessing myself, I figure out what is it I could do to possibly lower the impact of danger to other people, or what can I do to change my behavior so that I'm behaving more in line with the way God would want me to behave. And I do that every night, and I've done it virtually since I was 27 years old. And it's helped me deal with stuff on an everyday basis all the time, and hold myself accountable for trying to induce positive results for other people.
Steve, I have a question for you. So that quality of self-reflection and discernment, I think, is the basis for a contemplative life altogether. I mean, there's just no question about it. But how do we square, and I share that, but how do we square that with the fact that every good God-fearing person in history would say that they are trying to do what God calls them to do, and then look what we've created. You know what I mean? We've created all of this in the name of God in some ways, shape, or form. Or do you know what I'm saying? In the name of God, but everybody thinks they're doing the right thing. Everybody thinks that they have a, you know, that they're talking to their God or listening to their faith. And then we talking about systemic prejudices and biases. Look what we've created. So how do we go from that pristine, really beautiful self-evaluation into creating these systems that are just fabulously screwed up? And I just don't understand. It's a question, not a comment. Thank you so much.
Well, we need to be honest when we're asking for guidance, and we need to understand mistakes we make too, and try to correct those mistakes. And you know, I make mistakes and I try to correct them. So I don't know how other people do it. I've never had this conversation with any of you per se, but it's one that I have had with my kids. And I review my behaviors, and if I made a little niche of an error there, I hold myself accountable. I ask God for guidance. And to the extent I get it, I change my behavior. And that's the other thing is, I try not to judge other people. I try to understand why they are behaving the way they are, and what can I do to help them deal more successfully with issues in their life. So it's, and then that's what I've been doing. So
Yeah, and I think that's a good question, Tim. If anyone else wants to respond as well, just how do we go from that, looking at our own biases, our own perspective, to that more global systemic problem?
Yeah, I think part of it could, oh, sorry, Karen.
No, you can go ahead. I'll go after you.
All right, I'll make it quick then. I think a large part of it probably could go back to the golden rule. And what's the golden rule? The golden rule is treating others how you would like to be treated. And I think the responsibility for teaching the golden rule first goes to parents. So let me bring this back to the family. So parents probably could do a better job. I say that as a parent myself, and I know I could have done a better job, and we still have kids at home, so I still need to do a better job teaching kids the importance of the golden rule. But also, we have a tradition in our faith, it's called Christianity too, it's called repentance. And when it's identifying things that you've done wrong, stop doing those things. That's really important. Seek to fix those things, make amends if you can, and do everything you can not to do those things again. And I think those are things that I think the parents have the primary responsibility to teach that to their kids. And so if they did that, I think the world would be a better place. So golden rule and being taught by the families. Yeah.
thanks for reminding me of the golden rule.
Karen.
Anytime.
So from the courses, that my answer to Tim, it approaches it slightly differently. Of course, doing the right thing is always, the goal, and a good goal. But how it helps you look at your own stuff is that if you believe you're doing the right thing, if you believe you're on the right course, or that you're working for a right outcome for the world, then when things don't go the way you think they should, you're going to have an emotional reaction. You're going to get frustrated. You're going to feel fearful. You might feel hurt. And so what the course is saying is that whenever you have a conflicted reaction to something, we tend to then, from what you were saying, Tim, we think that we're thinking right, we're doing God's work. So we tend to sort of say, why aren't things acting, or people acting the way we think they should? Why isn't life going the way we think it should? And the course is, if you have that reaction, instead of thinking that you know how things should go, that reaction alerts you to the fact that it's just hit your bias. It's just hit your belief system. And instead of trying to make the world go the way you think it should, you need to unlearn how and sort of question why you think it should go that way. And so the course basically teaches, don't use your emotional distress as a clue that you need to make it go away. Use your emotional distress as a clue that you need to start to be aware of how you believe, and use an opportunity for unlearning what you think you need to. And so this is what the course calls your ego. Your ego is all of these biases and setup. And your ego is there to tell you to either avoid a group of people because, as you were saying, Ernest, they may be a threat, or make life go this way, or judge these people these ways, because the ego is always using your belief system for comparison and evaluation. And our distress tells us that we're in that place. And there is where we can turn on the light to the unlearning, to really look at our own bias, because our bias will come up. We'll know it's come up because of the distress. And that's how we can start to be aware of what we're blind to.
Really good.
And they said too often egos say, when I feel distress, I'm going to fix it so I don't have to feel it. And the course teaches us, take distress and realize it's not the world's problem. It's going on in you, and really learn what it is. And so this is how you can start to take away those biases, because systemic racism stuff comes from a group of people who all sort of have agreed this is the way it should be, and we've got the power to make it that way. And they've got to question that. It's like, how do I know how it should be?
So Karen, does that suggest then if somebody were in a right belief system that they wouldn't experience distress?
Well, to not feel distress, you would be in a no belief system. You would really be open to responding in the moment. There would be no preset, so that when the homeless person came into the church, you wouldn't have the distress of, oh my gosh, I've got things to do, because the person being there is there to talk to. I mean, it's really, I mean, and I think you'd be walking on water if you could actually be there all the time, but it's really being in the moment and not bringing sort of the past with you. And we need the past to evaluate. And so what it's really talking about is, how do you live in that constant communication with God, which is a in the moment thing. We filter it through our ego, which is that belief system. So you're always working on yourself, because we're always having an emotional reaction, and it's saying your emotional reaction is your responsibility. It's not the fault of the world. So it changes cause and effect. The world isn't causing me to be angry. My anger is causing me to sort of see an angry world. And it isn't, and so it really makes you have to be active and responsible.
I wanted to take a second to share a couple of things. One is going to the original question about how we address systemic racism. There are a couple of things that weren't said that I wanted to make sure are said. One, and this is part of what we're doing right now, but is acknowledging its existence. I think there's still a lot of people who don't think that it's a thing, that don't believe that kind of racism actually exists, that it's being overblown or whatever. But kind of making sure that we, that kind of collective universal, we understand that this is something that exists, and this is something that has existed kind of from the origins of our nation, is an important first step. And then also kind of towards the end of the process, maybe in terms of like a practical thing to do, is to talk to our people in office, talk to local, state, national politicians, let them know that this is an issue that's important. Let them know that we want to see actual substantive change in how things are done, and then go out and vote for those people who reflect someone who shares your values and you think will be willing and able to kind of make some of the hard decisions and have some of the difficult conversations that will really move this forward.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Scott. That kind of leads to another question a little bit, Karen, what you were saying in terms of like our personal responsibility for the collective. I'm curious to hear what you guys would say in terms of what is our role or responsibility in light of like what we are seeing happening in the world, police brutality, systemic racism. Like, we live in a world that is so interconnected. Is it each of our individual responsibility to fix this problem?
And is it also part of your religious belief? Like, do you get up on the pulpit on Sunday or whatever you do and, say as a religious leader, is it our job to vote, like you said, Scott, how much do you get into politics? It's an interesting jumping off point.
Then in our faith, we do encourage everybody to vote, but we don't tell people who to vote for. And it really is important to exercise that constitutional right to vote. I think we have a tradition in our faith too, that we believe that people should be punished for their own transgressions and not for the transgressions of others. However, with responsibility for fixing this problem, it is really everybody's responsibility to fix this problem. Every adult, anyway, who's in this country, to fix our own problems. And part of that's voting. That's that maybe getting heavily involved in politics or telling those elected leaders what you believe should happen. And so I think those are just, some of our ideas and our position in our faith.
Yeah, no, I think you brought up a really interesting point, which is the difference between sort of guilt by association and then responsibility moving forward. So for instance, I'm not guilty of creating the systems, let's say that before I was born or before I could impact the world I was in. But I am responsible moving forward, knowing what I know, seeing what I see as a moral person to do what I can. And that's really a helpful point. It helps me a lot because sometimes I get stuck when there's an assumption that somehow I'm guilty out of the gate, for things that I wasn't even here for. But I am responsible moving forward. That helps.
I think we're all responsible to the extent that we actively listen to our conscience and we interact with others, then we should follow our own behavior with regard to our conscience and seek to support decision makers as they move towards a just way to do things. And if we have to put forward a particular plan for zoning or something else, and then talk to people about it to meet the community's needs, we need to do that kind of thing, rather than just expect other people to step forward all by themselves. If we have learned certain things, we need to share those things and present community-based solutions and try to convince others that those are worth their consideration. And yeah, I'm 75 now, so I'm probably not going to be as involved in the community in the future as I have been in the past, but this has been my course of action.
The young 75, very youthful.
But I think we have to be careful. And this is where we can support and give backing to a voice, but we have to talk and listen to the people who are experiencing the problem. We can't come in like we're some saviors and say we have the idea. We've got, since it's not most of our experiences, we can't assume we know what the fix is, but we can go and marshal support behind the people that are experiencing the problem and say, we're backing you, and so I sometimes also feel like we've got to watch being arrogant enough to think that we can solve a problem, because how can you solve a problem when you don't understand all the nuances of the issue? I mean, yes, we're talking about policing in a penal system, but you also look at COVID and you realize healthcare and a variety of other things are all disproportionately being put on people of color. I mean, this is a systemic prejudice that has its fingers into so many different aspects of life, that to just get on one bandwagon and think that, it's really starting to ask questions. I go back to what Scott said. I think at this point, there's a lot more of just questions we've got to ask before we start really focusing on answers. And I think to that degree, we've got to stop assuming we know what's going on.
I did not suggest that we just talk about answers.
Oh, no, I wasn't. I was actually, we can just jump into sometimes solving things from a perspective. I mean, you said, Tim McCarthy, I sort of laughed when you said on the pulpit on Sunday, but of the people here, not everybody does their religious service on Sunday. There's Fridays, there's Saturdays. And so we tend to think about things like the religions are getting together on Sunday, but that's not the truth. And so it's like, how do we keep opening our minds to sort of realize that, as Joanne was saying, some of the words we use don't quite fit everybody.
Right.
I think it's definitely the perspective, or it's definitely the place of us as individuals, and it's definitely the place of us as religious leaders to speak out against oppression, against prejudice, against racism, against sexism, against, and I could go on and on and on. All of these different things that are unfortunately a part of our society, and they are a part of our socialization. And yes, the guilt that I think when you start a conversation that we want to lead towards transformation, when you start that with guilt, you really aren't going to get anywhere. When you start it with open conversations, when you start it with a lot of grace, that's where you're going to be able to move. And I think as far as a religious leader, we have to be able to be uncomfortable and possibly to make people that are part of our religious tradition uncomfortable, because in discomfort comes learning, understanding, listening. And that's where we get to that place of being able to transform the systems that are creating so much heartache, so much death, so much of the problems that we're seeing today.
I think that's a really important point, Maggie. Like, I feel like that is the skillful means to, like, you can disagree with someone, but if you start attacking them and belittling them or whatever, if they're not hearing what you have to say, there's no real transformation that's going to happen. And it isn't to push it aside and soft pedal it. You can be hard hitting, but it comes from a place of respect. And that, to me, is where real change starts to take place. People they're not going to, if you tell them they should think a certain way, they're not, whatever, you can do that all day long and it's going to go nowhere. But if you can really, like, sort of get to their emotion and their core belief system, that is what impacts powerful, long-lasting change.
Absolutely.
Yeah. I have more questions for you all, but I also want to give our participants time and an opportunity to ask questions. So I want to put that out there now. If anyone in the audience has a question, you are welcome to either type it into the Q&A. And if you would like to ask a question, we can unmute you and let you ask it yourself. If you want to just raise your hand, I will just keep an eye out if anyone raises their hand or if they post in the Q&A. So maybe while we look at that, I'm wondering if any of you could talk about what you are doing. Are any of you addressing this in your faiths? What, like Maggie, I like how you said, you have to use grace instead of guilt. Like, how do you do that? Like, are you guys having these conversations in your congregations? Is this something you're bringing up? I'd love to hear from any of you on that.
And we actually had a sermon on Sunday about racism and discrimination that one of my colleagues gave to our congregation. And he talked about how, we as a faith, we condemn all racism, past and present, in any form. And because we consider ourselves all brothers and sisters, or beloved equals, as you read in the statement at the very beginning. So, yeah, and it was And a lot of people went up to this individual after the sermon, after the service, and said that they really liked the words that they heard, and it was helping them. So I think it's important to talk about, at least for our faith.
Great, thanks, Noel. Others? This actually was one of the questions from one of the attendees.
So this week at Heart of Steamboat, we started, Tim and I are doing a series on racism and Christianity, and we're just calling it Conversations on Racism and Christianity, what it is. And we started that. We are both reading a piece together and then discussing it in this exact same format on Zoom that gets broadcast to Facebook. And then we've invited people to meet socially distanced in our courtyard to have conversations, to ask questions, to learn, to talk about different things like policing and microaggressions, so that we can understand where the problems are, what is systemic racism, how can we become better allies to our friends, known and unknown, that are people of color and people experiencing marginalization. And just to open up that conversation. I think sometimes, at least in churches that I've been a part of, when something is controversial or taboo, we really like to back away from it because it's uncomfortable. But to create a place, and we're going to start off all of our sessions saying, this is a place of grace and understanding. Even if you think you're saying it wrong, go ahead and say it. That's how we all learn. As to not put people in a place where they're too uncomfortable to learn.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Maggie. Other ideas? Are you guys talking about this in your congregations and addressing it? How's it going?
We haven't had any specific programs about it, but I have worked it into my homilies on Sunday. Just the idea that God's plan for us is harmony, love, peace, mutual support, brother and sister, just that idea, the kingdom of God. Jesus came to promote the kingdom of God. And that's all about, respecting everyone, and the golden rule, treat others as you want to have them treat you. And so I've spoken about it with respect to the scriptures in general ways, not referring to anything specific. I talked about people of all different colors just living harmoniously together as an ideal of the scriptures there that we're called to. And I just referred to it in general ways, but we haven't had a particular program about it. But I really admire what Heart of Steamboat is doing. It's a great idea, Maggie. I thank you. Congratulations. I just give you affirmation on that. Good job. And what's the book you guys are reading?
So we're actually taking from a bunch of different books. And I think one of the reasons we did that was to get a bunch of different authors' perspectives. What we started with was a book that was, oh my gosh, called, I want to call it one thing, but I know it's something else. It's by Drew Hart. It's about changing the way that we see racism in the church and becoming an anti-racist church, which the term anti-racist is something I think a lot of people haven't heard until recently. And it's the idea of we might not be racist, but what does it mean to be anti-racist, to be very explicitly against all systems of racism? Let me grab that book really quick and I will tell you exactly what it is.
I'm interested, Maggie, you talked about all systems of racism. So do you see racism as going beyond ethnicity into other areas, or is that just prejudice? In my brain, there's prejudice. Racism kind of relates to ethnicity, but do you see it with a bigger perspective, a bigger definition of racism?
I would say that racism is, so racism and ethnicity are different in my understanding. Race has to do with a color or a physical appearance. Ethnicity has to do with a heritage and an understanding of where that ethnic background. So someone can be Black and be ethnically French, exactly. So there's that difference. But one of the things to understand, or that I really have tried to understand, is that even within specific races, there is prejudice. So colorism is a thing where, so especially in the United States, people who are considered Black but have a lighter skin tone are given more privilege than people who are Black and have a darker skin tone.
Huh.
So just all of those intricacies. And the book is called The Trouble I've Seen by Drew Hart, that we started with this week.
Thank you.
Okay, so let's jump to another question. There's a couple questions here around the role of family in this, that just to summarize maybe two different questions, that if families are not able and capable to teach the golden rule or teach their children about racism, how else, if that breaks down, and they're talking about how the families are breaking down in terms of higher divorce rates and single parenting and things like that, how else can we address this? I know, Ernest, earlier you mentioned education, and a lot of you talked about looking at ourselves. Any other thoughts on that with I think they're asking with the lack of family?
Well, I think one thing I think we should be very careful about how we define family for one thing, that it certainly the meaning of that has expanded, and I think for the good. But I think some of it is that as those of us who are adults, and especially those who are kind of emerging into adulthood now, who are, if they choose to do so, will be starting families in the next 5 years, 10 years, whatever, to make sure that these concepts are really solidified within with that group, and then hopefully we can kind of start to create a new cycle, I suppose, of teaching and learning from generation to generation, where some of the things that we are now grappling with are, that we've in many of our cases kind of have learned over the course of our lifetimes thus far. These are things that can be instilled from the jump, and so that kids who will begin growing up in the next now and in the next number of years, like that we can start kind of generationally to imagine, okay, how do we want this generation to develop? How do we want this generation to emerge? And recognize kind of, and be very intentional about that. And so not only, but in order to do that, we have to make sure that the people who will be the parents to that generation that have absorbed these concepts, have absorbed these ideas, and this is something that I think we sometimes underestimate, can convey them to their kids. I think it's one thing for each of us to understand something for ourselves, but to convey something to a child especially is a very different kind of experience. And so not only making sure that our communities understand the ideas, but maybe teaching how to then transmit those ideas onward.
Great. Yeah, thanks, Scott. I just want to mention a resource that someone posted, Ibram Kendi's book, How to Be an Anti-Racist, a really excellent and deep dive into systemic racism. And it said some of the issues you were talking about, Maggie, are covered in that book as well. So just to mention that for those who are listening. And then it looks like Larry has a question. Larry Klingman, I'm going to allow you to talk.
Can I make a comment to the last question about?
Sure. One sec, Larry.
I'm not terribly sure that the breakdown of the family or single parent families necessarily have any negative thing about the golden rule. You know, in a way, I'm certainly not saying it's better, but with single parent families, they are more dependent on the community for the support. And so the child's going to be exposed to, you know, different ways of thinking if they go into daycare early, whatever, they're in preschool. And so in some ways, you know, that exposure, it's still up to the basic caretaker if the child hears different ways of thinking of how to expand that. But I don't necessarily think that just because you don't have a tight nuclear family, that that child isn't going to learn the golden rule or understand how that they interact with a greater community.
Let me comment on that. I wasn't talking about a nuclear family.
No, I wasn't. I was just
Yeah.
answering that question. No, I wasn't commenting to you.
I had a discussion several years ago with a retired detective in Idaho who dealt with juvenile delinquents. He said, without exception, almost without exception, the people that he was dealing with, that he had to incarcerate, were coming from broken families. And you really do learn the important things in life from your family. Of course, the community is there too. In Steamboat, we're so lucky to have such great organizations as clubs, Girl Scouts, Boy Scouts, other types of clubs, recreation clubs, teams at school, or clubs at school as well. And you learn so much from those, from the leaders in those organizations. And so, yes, you can get a lot of important knowledge that I think will help you in life. But if your family's busted up, you're going to be put at a significant disadvantage in this life. There's no doubt in my mind about that.
I think that everyone would probably agree with that, Newell, but it's also a reality that we live in a world where families are, you know, they are broken families. And I think I feel like that is.
Yeah. So let's have some government solutions maybe to promote families being together instead of some policies that we have that don't promote that. That's another change I'd like to see. And I think it would fix a lot of these problems we're seeing today.
I think one of the wonderful places to start with that would be to reform our mass incarceration system, which breaks up so many families, and predominantly families of low income and predominantly families of color.
Right.
So as we talk about these different things, we see how cyclical they become, and how one thing affects another, and then that affects an education system, and then how that affects where someone ends up 20 years later in life.
Mm-hmm.
I think we have like 25% of the world, of the people that are incarcerated. I think we have 25% of those in our country. And and we're not 25% of the world's population in this country.
Right.
Right.
What about Larry's question?
Yeah, let's get to Larry. Go ahead, Larry.
Okay, it's actually Joella.
Oh, Joelle.
Sorry.
Rick. I am listening to all of you and thinking about how over the years you have all, for me, always modeled my ideal of religious leaders. But I also remember from my childhood and also from my time with Harmish, the people of various congregations who have grown up and believe that showing up for services on the appropriate day and reciting the prescribed devotions is what they expect to do in their religious experience. The only thing that they should be challenged on is their failure to have memorized the appropriate words or to follow the exact rules that have been presented since childhood. So what are we all saying at this point? Are we saying that in Steamboat, or maybe in a larger world, the religious leaders are kind of giving up on these folks? And if not, what is the conversation, if there is one, if they haven't walked out of your service recently, with people who say, this is not what I expect of my religious leaders. This is something completely different, and I reject it. I don't want to see it in my church, in my synagogue, in my temple.
And by it, am I assuming you're meaning the discussion on racism?
Absolutely.
Okay.
So I'll start. By the way, hi Joella. So in terms of and it's funny because I was involved in a conversation with some people about this today actually. In terms of the idea that these kinds of topics shouldn't be brought up in a religious setting or religious institution. For one, that feels a lot like the whole kind of shut up and dribble approach that people tend to throw at professional athletes. That you have a narrow lane, stay in your narrow lane. Please don't explore outward. Which is an idea that I think we can and should reject. That our houses of worship, our places of faith are places where we seek to live out our highest values and ideals. And when we see that our community or our nation or our world are not living up to what we see as those highest values or ideals, then it is the perfect place to have those conversations. It is the best place to have those conversations. Because we are institutions that are based on deeply held values and values that we try and put into work on a day-to-day basis. And so, when those values are being trampled upon, then we owe it to ourselves, we owe it to our communities and to our nation to speak to those and to address those. And there's a phrase, and I don't know where it comes from, but the idea is it says, pray as if everything pray as if everything depended on God, and act as if everything depends on you. And so I think that concept of prayer is great, prayer is important, both in terms of how it makes us feel personally, how it makes us feel communally, the ideas that it brings out and brings forward. But that can't be the end of it. We can't leave those thoughts and feelings inside the space where we worship, whatever that space may be. We have to translate those prayers into action.
Great. Thanks, Scott.
I agree.
All right. Well, I think we're just coming to the end of our time. There's some interest in us having an ongoing discussion about race on a weekly basis. I don't think we can offer it quite so often, but we'll take it under consideration. I want to thank our leaders for being a part of this conversation tonight. I know this can be a vulnerable place to be talking about something that may not be in your wheelhouse, that some of you have acknowledged is sort of intimidating, but I think this is the beginning of change, like to be willing to have these discussions. So I just really appreciate each of you for having the willingness to look at this in your own lives, in your congregations, as leaders of our faith communities and Steamboat. I'm really inspired by all of you being willing to engage in this conversation. And I'd like to thank all of our participants too, who have shown up and participated, because you also are doing your part again to raise awareness and move this conversation forward. And hopefully maybe there was something that one of the leaders said today that strikes you, or that you may find a way to move this out in your circles, in your family, in your communities, and the people that you touch. And that this can ripple out from our homes to our community and in the world. So
Can I add something to that, Marshall? And that is, you know, here in Steamboat, we may feel like there's not a lot we can do. We might protest on the courtyard. But as with what Scott was saying, by admitting that there is an issue and by bringing it up and discussing it among ourselves with friends, we keep the conversation going. And we, every conversation we have, we can use that as an opportunity to learn more about other people's perspectives. And if we keep doing this, this conversation is going to grow so that even in a small place like Steamboat, we can be part of that awareness, that awakening that Scott was talking about, where this is an issue and we need to address it. We can't just talk about it for a few months and let it go away. I mean, quite frankly, often over these last several weeks, I've heard people say, I thought this was all resolved in the 60s. You know, I thought we addressed it then. And so if some people thought that this was a 60s issue and it's over, we've got to start talking about this a lot more and not let it leave the consciousness of people, because we can't just say we do a quick fix and then it goes into the closet until it blows up again. So we can all do something even here in Steamboat, and that is keep the dialogue going, keep asking questions. I love what you're doing, Maggie, you know, and that's what we can do. So we can all be active.
yeah, great. Thank you, Karen. A couple of just small notes. This is being live streamed on Facebook, and it will be available if anybody wanted to share it with any friends or family, this conversation. It's on our Facebook page. And we also have a webpage, exploringthesacred.org. If anyone wants to sign up for our email list, you can go there. There's also a place if you would like to donate that makes these events possible. We would be very grateful to you. So thank you everyone for joining us. And we'll let you know when we do it again. Good evening.
Good evening.
Thank you, everybody.
Bye, guys. Thanks.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.